In our last video, we talked about how we've been dealing with too much information for most of the last century. Over the course of that century, we massively increased our ability to collect and store information, but basically ended up with the same set of problems that Vannevar Bush was confronting in the 1940s. We had too much information, but lacked the context to make sense of it all. This video will show how our modern tools could help us escape this overload of information. In 2023, we're still using the same basic system that on the web that Tim Berners-Lee started in 1989. It made sharing information easy, but organizing it remained elusive. We've built what amounts to a massive collection of filing cabinets. Tools like Google help us find things, but it's like using a card catalog in a library. We still have to know what we're looking for, where to look, and then make sense of what we find. And with more data and algorithms that bias toward engagement and advertising, even that task is getting harder, not easier. To contextualize and remix the information that we find, we need to connect it in many ways. We should be able to change those connections easily to discover new things. Pioneers like Vannevar Bush, Ted Nelson, and Doug Engelbart knew this, but our current systems don't do this well because they are still stuck in that paper metaphor. Many thought social media would create connections between us and the stories we tell. For the most part, it didn't. Instead, it added to the noise. It created incentives for companies to monetize based on the loudest and most outrageous voices, because they drove engagement with their platforms. These algorithms increased the negative effects of information overload because they made contextualizing information even harder. To drive engagement, algorithms sorted people into information silos to keep them connected with the people they agreed with, but not seeing the wider picture. Our way of connecting information is still very linear, like in the stories we've always told. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. When things don't make sense, we try to force them into linear pathways in order to make sense of them. However, that's not how the real world works. Maps provide us with another way of sense-making that is not linear and more closely mirrors the world around us. As we started to explore the world beyond familiar surroundings, it became harder and harder to make sense of it all. Sharing this knowledge required great skill and was often hidden for commercial advantage. Professional navigators and map makers were necessary to make sense of this world and to illustrate it in the system. Ideas resemble maps more than they do lines. We assemble new ideas out of clusters of old ones in the way that a navigator would assemble waypoints on his way to India. However, until fairly recently, text-based technology solutions, from books to the web, did not provide us with tools simple enough for most of us to make route maps through our exploding information environments. It may now be possible to escape our filing cabinets by employing tools that allow us to become map makers through the sea of informations. Instead of maps of ocean connections, we can now connect nodes of narrative to one another. In the early 2000s, software for making maps became much more accessible. It helped people navigate the huge amount of information that computers and the internet were generating. Those who could make sense of this informational flood around them had a competitive advantage. Collaborative concept mapping started to emerge as a business practice. In addition to keeping pace with information flows, we learned that looking at connections could disrupt preconceived ideas and ways of thinking. Like the map makers of old, when we construct visual maps, it lets us see new patterns in the world and untangle complex systems, whether we're talking about stories or geographic features. Platforms like Miro now let many people work together, both at the same time and separately, to analyze patterns of information. Distributed sense making lets us overcome time and distance in our brainstorming practices. By opening doors to more and more participants, this kind of map making creates opportunities to diversify our conversations. It is a critical tool for me when I teach and consult remotely. Most think of concept mapping as flat, but by linking different maps together, we can add yet another dimension to our explorations of ideas and expand our ability to tackle complex problems. Subgroups can work on distinct maps and break down specific aspects of a complex set of issues, but then link them to other subgroups or to a master document. This is possible with Miro today, and I've begun to explore it in my own work. But even this idea favors connections that are linear and static. It shows them, but doesn't fully capture the dynamics of how they might be connected to one another. It's possible to imagine much more fluid ways to explore information using layered concept maps with non-linear connections, even if we aren't quite there yet technically or perceptually. This kind of fluid, layered map starts to approach the dynamic information environment Ted Nelson envisioned decades ago with the Xanadu project. There is a hitch, however. These maps can get complicated fast. Concept mapping helps us begin to map our complex information environments. However, we need something more to achieve the connected information space that Nelson dreamed of in any sort of approachable manner. Generative AI might be that missing piece. We'll talk about that in our final video.